Oh, hi there. This is Liv just popping into your listening experience to tell you, or remind you, that I have got another book coming out. Nectar of the Gods is not only a book of 75 Greek mythology themed cocktails, but it's also the nerdiest, silliest book of obscure myth and history facts and anecdotes, nestled alongside some incredibly tasty cocktail recipes. Pre-order Nectar of the Gods by me, Liv Albert, wherever you get your books. Thanks to Acast for hosting and monetizing the podcast. Oh, hi, hello, welcome. This is Let's Talk About Myths, baby. And I am that woman, that host, Liv. Here today with, as always, a very special conversation episode. Because obviously, they're always special. I fucking love talking to academics and nerds and experts in whatever forms. It's just so fun. We all get to learn so much. And now, we're dipping our toes into Egypt. Kind of, sort of, a little bit, at least. Because today's conversation is all about Isis. Isis. In ancient Greece. Yes, today I'm joined with Dr. Lindsey Mazurek, who's just written a book about Isis worship in ancient Greece. And, well, my mind has been entirely blown by this conversation, not only because I absolutely love the intersection between Greek religion and mythology and that of the rest of the wider ancient Mediterranean, how those things overlapped and blended together over time, but also because it turns out Isis worship was pretty intense and cool and fascinating and weird. I know I'm a broken record when it comes to this, but I just fucking love having these conversations, getting to learn all of this stuff, and then I get to share with you. It's the coolest thing to ever happen to this podcast, and that you all love it and just want more of this intensely nerdy, specific, and sometimes supremely academic stuff is such a thrill. And I've got so much more coming. Today's episode is incredibly fascinating, just unbelievably interesting. I mean, Isis, she's Egyptian explicitly, and then what? The Greeks take her over and do something really interesting? The Romans too, even? Okay, we'll get into it. But also you'll hear me reference an episode in this one that is devoted to the Hellenistic period, where we'll get more background on that time period that Lindsey's talking about, along with so much more. That episode is coming soon, along with ancient sea monsters, and oh god, so much more. I've been recording so many incredible conversations to bring you. Just you wait. But today, fucking Isis, the ancient as fuck Egyptian goddess, and the time she became a Greek goddess in the most interesting of ways. Conversations, Retconning the Olympians, Isis worship in ancient Greece with Dr. Lindsey Mazurek. Isis, but not Isis, more like, I was just sort of, I haven't had a chance to fully read the article you sent me, but is it women who wear Isis's clothing? Basically just tell me everything and I'm trying to, remember things.
Yeah. So I've been working on the ways in which the worship of Egyptian deities gets sort of brought into what I call the northern half of the Mediterranean, so basically the Greco-Roman world in a lot of ways. The book I wrote is specifically focusing in on Greece under the Roman Empire, and it's really, that was one of those things where when I started working on this project, people thought, is that enough? Like, is that important enough? And really it's one of those things that once you start sort of poking at it, you realize just how popular and how widespread this really was. I mean, we have archaeological and epigraphic evidence for the worship of Isis in basically every like mid-sized town in the Roman Empire, more or less,
Wow.
that we've looked at. It's everywhere from like Hadrian's Wall in Britain to modern Afghanistan. It's extremely widespread, and it's something that we really haven't. I mean, there is a very vibrant field of ISIS studies. I shouldn't downplay that, but I think in particular, sort of the bigger world that has studied sort of more mainstream Roman culture, you really don't see a discussion of this religion. And so one of the questions I've been sort of interested in is trying to figure out really how does this religion sort of figure into day-to-day life in sort of regular Roman cities.
That's so interesting. I'm constantly wanting to learn more about the way that, mythological characters or religious, aspects of those people or what have you, like extend so beyond the Greco-Roman, like what we really understand as their world. And of course, Egypt is like the big one, because so much of their mythology and their like culture did spread in that way. But this was such a perfect timing, because I was like, I really want to expand beyond our general understanding of Greece and Rome. And so Isis is, I mean, I know she's one of the big ones, but I mean, that's so fascinating. So tell me about like the religion and the way it kind of worked. I mean, maybe, and I don't even know, in relation to the mythological character, but also obviously beyond.
So in terms of sort of the historical transfer, one of the things that's quite interesting that we see during the Ptolemaic period is there's a lot of Isis sort of starts subsuming other deities. The Ptolemies, like most Egyptian dynasties before them, used mythology and gods for very political purposes. So they personally identify very closely with Isis, and they kind of made a new consort for her, Serapis. Osiris is pretty problematic from a Greco-Roman perspective because he's dead and a mummy. So he does get worshipped, but he's definitely never as popular as Serapis, who is not dead and not a mummy. Because there's always a lot of issues around mummification in our in our Roman text. That's often one of the things that's most often used to sort of like racially segregate. Like those Egyptians are super weird. They mummify. They find that very upsetting. Yeah, that and the animal-headed deities. Those are like the two things that most often come up as like the sort of like really racially othering characteristics that get brought up.
Those are such major parts of Egypt, like, or what we know of as Egypt. Or like, me as I don't know a ton about Egyptian mythology beyond a lot of animal-headed deities and mummification.
It's fascinating because that's definitely, I mean, in some ways, Herodotus's account of Egyptian religion and culture for the 5th century so deeply shapes the popular imagination even today, because those are like the things that we immediately jump to mind. That, like the pyramids, at least in my book, I think it's so closely tied to this initial impression. But the Ptolemies get very excited about Isis and Serapis, who's her sort of like very bland consort. He doesn't have a ton of personality, and so they actually start doing things like taking over sites that had been traditionally assigned to other deities like Hathor. And so really by the end of the Ptolemaic period, you actually have a whole new religious definition of what Isis is. She's a deity. The term is henotheism. She basically is the main deity, and all other gods are just like avatars of her, more or less.
Ooh.
And so you start seeing in like at the end of the 4th century BCE, beginning of the 3rd century, like this very small wave of Egyptian priests that are moving to Greek port cities and founding this cult. And like, I don't know that if this is the Ptolemies like sending out some sort of like cultural propaganda mission, if this is just part of a bigger, this is also a period in which they have stronger control of the Aegean Sea. Exactly why they go is not too extremely clear to me, but this sort of marks the beginning of a new type of Isis movement, in which there had always been Egyptians living in Greece and worshiping Isis, like sort of privately among themselves. But now you start to see cult groups that are actually open to a much bigger group of people, particularly Greek speakers and people who are sort of native to Greek cities. And so that's one aspect of it. And in terms of the mythology, though, this part is actually really exciting to me. I spend a lot of time on this in my book. They actually start kind of what we would call retconning Greek, like Homeric mythology, to make Isis fit there. So there's this set of hymns that might compare them like the Nicene Creed. They're very much like, this is who Isis is, this is who her family members are, this is what she's done. And so you have examples saying things like Isis is the daughter of Cronus, which would of course make her like Demeter's sister and, one of the original Olympian deities.
Yeah.
It's really weird. This is definitely the strategy they've chosen.
Wow. What? That's mind blowing. Obviously.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the retconning of things like that in general has always really interested me. I think a lot about like Theseus, the way he's sort of like inserted into everything afterwards. Like once Athens becomes this major power, and they're like, okay, turns out Theseus was like there the whole time. How convenient. But yeah, but to insert somebody like into the Olympians feels like very over the top in an interesting way. Yeah.
Very bold move. Yeah, and so you get things, and then you also get her sort of, she's now given these roles in Greek history that are very traditionally bound. So she like invents writing, which is Hermes' deal, and she invents laws, which is Athena's deal, and she invents the proper negotiation of sexual relationships and family relationships.
Wow.
And so she's like, she's extremely powerful, obviously, for her devotees, but she's also just, again, like taking up space that is very defined in the traditional like Greek mythological world, and defined from the 8th century BC.
I was going to say, like 1,000 years worth of definition of these people, and then to suddenly be like, okay, so Isis did all of this.
Yeah, so that's really fascinating to me. Is that's one of the major strategies they use, is to really make up a whole new mythology for her that is very fundamental, and at the same time they can't make her not Egyptian, right? She can't be just the daughter of Prometheus, because that like is very fundamental. It's a different goddess if she's not Egyptian.
Yeah.
So then you get these really fun little like nuances in the Greek verbs, where she was, raised in Egypt, but she like favors Athens and Greece, and she like she has these like connections where she's the same as in one. I think in one that's actually from Egypt. At Medina at Mahdi, they actually start describing her as, the Thracians call you this name, the Phrygians call you this name, the Greeks call you this name. And it's just a laundry list of some of the most famous goddesses, like Hera and Leto and Hestia. And it's bizarre that that's, again, the way they've gone about it.
That's really interesting. The only connection I've ever really known of, but I stick, and I'm trying to expand, but historically I stick very much in like archaic and classical. But there's a story of her being kind of related to or the same as Io, right? Like Io comes and wanders around, and then she lands in Egypt, and she becomes Isis, and she like founds the Egyptian people, and then they go on to found the Argives, and there's the connection kind of thing.
Right.
So does that get used, or is it sort of like making her way more important even than Io?
It's interesting because the Greeks don't seem to care very much about Io. There's not really a ton of discussion about her in the sort of the cult practice itself.
Yeah.
But then when you go to Pompeii, there's actually a really large cycle of paintings inside the temple to Isis there that depicts the myth of Io. And one of the things is we don't have a ton of wall painting outside of southern Italy, just because the Vesuvian eruption preserves so much there, and it's just sort of this weird little bubble that we have there.
Yeah.
So we don't know how these things were painted, and so there could very, very well have been similar styles of painting. My research has revealed there is a certain amount of they look pretty different, but in terms of like architectural plan, but there really is actually quite a lot of consistency in terms of this desire to create sort of this Egyptian landscape inside the temple that could easily have been affected through wall painting.
Interesting.
It's gone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the things that we don't have is my constant, like, I want to think about it absolutely all the time. And then what we know of Pompeii, and then, or I think of Akrotiri a lot as well, like, because I just focus on older, and just like, oh, well, like, what? Did the rest look like that? Or did it not? Is this totally like, its own thing entirely, but it's all we know? That's so interesting. So these sources that like, create or make Isis into this major like Greek goddess. Are they like more literary, more religious? Like what kind? You said they were hymns, right? So what kind of,
Yeah.
yeah, like how does that work?
So they're fascinating. We have, I mean, depending on how you're defining sort of the edges of your corpus, we have somewhere around between like a half dozen to a dozen. They're all from Greece or Asia Minor and the islands. They don't appear anywhere else. But then it's clear that, so most of them we think were set up in temples and actually read. So Ian Moyer at the University of Michigan has actually proven that they're all punctuated in the same way, which suggests that they're actually being read as part of sort of like, there's a desire to have consistency across the different sites that are using them. So it's possible they're read as part of a ritual. So that's pretty exciting to find that. But in terms of, it's kind of interesting because they also have a second life. It's very clear that these texts are very easy for people outside the cults to find. So for example, at the beginning of Book 11 of Apuleius's Metamorphoses, the whole part where he becomes Isis frees him from his donkey body and then he becomes like an Isis devotee. It actually begins with sort of an adapted version of one of these hymns. It's very, very close. Diodorus Siculus has an account of it, of one that he says he saw, in Memphis at the Temple of Ptah, that's written down there. It's clear that Plutarch knows about them because he also sort of includes lots of them, like aspects of these texts, in a weird treatise he writes on Isis and Osiris. So it's clear that actually a lot of people knew about these, even if they weren't actually in the cult itself.
Right.
It wasn't that secret.
Yeah. I somehow this happens to me every single time as if it's brand new, but I just love learning stuff like this so much. God, the amount that we're able to know from all of these different little bits and pieces and put them all together in these ways is just so incredible and fascinating.
It's really one of the coolest things is always to see someone like Ian does work that's very like, I mean, he's a historian, but he also can do very technical philology, which is very much not what I do. But that we can use all these different tools and methods to kind of reveal these things that are then so important to people who are working in other fields. So I love that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, just as somebody who is not in academia, but just has the fortune to get to talk to people all the time, just the different things you learn from the way that different things are studied all over is just, it's constantly mind-boggling to me. But that sort of is just a very broad statement about what I get to do, and I'm very glad that this is my job. I just generally the way that some of these things have spread from, from Egypt or from anywhere really. But do we have any kind of good idea about like what stood out to them about Isis, like what it was that made her this special person?
It's really hard to say because, some people in other contexts, it's clear that Isis has a very important like funerary afterlife perspective. Certainly in Egypt, that was a big part of what she was offering. That doesn't seem to be what the Greeks are interested in. There's almost no discussion of her in context, in connection with like death, for example, or afterlife or rebirth, which you actually get in some of the other cults, like the cults of Dionysus, for example. They don't really seem to be looking to her for that. This could be one of the things I'm interested in as a historian is the sort of social aspects of this cult. So what is it that you get sort of from the social aspects of being in this rather close community? Because it is a community that isn't just you show up whenever. It does have sort of this procedure, at least in several places, of kind of being initiated and going down the garden path to become closer and closer to the deity. One of the things I think it does offer is this sort of sense of community. It's clear that particularly in the early phases, this community, a lot of migrants are joining this cult, particularly Italian merchants who are trading in Greece. We can tell that. And so it's interesting to sort of think about, you have to do certain rituals. You have to sort of adhere to certain rules. You have to, potentially come, ideally a certain number of times and perform, daily attendance to the deity. And so for particularly those who are really into the cult, you could really gain a lot of identity from that. You could really gain a lot of a sense of self. But of course, one of our bigger questions is, how often do you have to go to really count? Like, I grew up
Mm-hmm.
Catholic, and so you could easily be like a Christmas and Easter Catholic, and you could still be culturally Catholic, but go to mass maybe twice a year. And is that something similar here? It's not super clear. But one of the other things that does seem to be appealing to Isis, to people about Isis, is she does carry this sort of exoticism with her. And cultural appropriation is, of course, not something that we would encourage or think is a good thing to do, but it's popular. People enjoy appropriating other cultures. They like it. It's attractive in some sense. It gives you this feeling of power and control over things you can't control. And so I think that's got to be at least part of it, is this sense that you get to kind of have access to the exotic.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, like those people to the south. Um, so what do we know about like women involved in the cult? Was it
Mm-hmm.
pretty like, across the board of genders, or was it specific to any particular type of person?
It's pretty wide ranging. You definitely have people who are Greek, people who are immigrants. You have people who are definitely more powerful and wealthy. You have people who are members of the same family, people who aren't. It's always harder to identify people who are poor. It does seem like at some point people were enslaved to the god. Actually, that happened in some contexts, particularly in the area around Delphi. But
Huh.
it's pretty wide ranging. And in terms of gender, one of the things this is a kind of disappointing, frankly. When you think of Isis today, you kind of think of the neo-pagan thing, right? You think of
Mm.
these very feminist neo-pagan cultures. And that's unfortunately not what we get with the cult of Isis. It's fairly clear that most sites, most cult communities wouldn't allow women to be priestesses, wouldn't allow
Oh.
them to hold a lot of important roles in the cult. And the times in which they were selected to do those seem to be like total one-offs, like somebody died and here's the filler. So that is a bit disappointing. And there is a sense that Isis, has she's a female deity, but she wants you to act in very traditional ways.
Hmm.
So there's not a sense of like liberation here. And we do actually also have like weird little moments, like very early on in the cult. We have evidence of a lot of cultic rules, which seems to have just been relatively popular to do in the Hellenistic period across all cults. But you have actually some moments where like women are banned from at least parts of sanctuaries. Women who are menstruating just generally can't go into sanctuaries in Greece, period. And yeah, and then like after giving birth or having an abortion, you can't enter for a certain number of days after that either. So there's a lot of regulation around women's bodies, a lot of discussion. And it's interesting too, because actually if you look at like the Latin poets, the thing that they are always talking about Isis in contact with is that the women can't have sex with them. Their lovers are Isis devotees, and they can't have sex. And this is like, oh, of course, a horrible thing.
That's very Roman.
Very Roman.
I just recently read a ton of the Ars Amatoria for
Yeah.
Valentine's Day, and that feels very
Interesting choice.
very Ars Amatoria. I know, yeah. It was a very me choice to be like, this is your romance material is the grossest thing in the world. That's really interesting. It feels very Athena to me, the way you described her as being, like a woman, but very traditional, because so often the way I feel like Athena is interpreted in the text that we have is like she's kind of the man's goddess, she's like the hero's goddess. She's a goddess, but also like she was beloved by men, pretty widely. And I don't know enough about the cults of worship around these people. I'm more about the stories, trying to learn more about the beyond the stories. But yeah, it just feels to me very, very Athena, like kind of taking on that role of like, yes, she's a woman, but she's kind of like a token woman to sort of,
she's a cool woman.
Yeah, she's like the manic pixie dream girl, but like of the ancient world.
Again, it's one of those things I think I often get that question when I'm giving talks, and people are like, what about women? What about feminism? And generally the ancient world is not a good place to go if you want to hear nice things about women and feminism.
That much I know. I've made to build my career based on that, at least.
But it is, I think, one of the things that's kind of fascinating about her is that she she's clearly the driving force here. Like Serapis is kind of just here for the ride. He doesn't have a ton of personality on his own. But Isis, even despite her centrality, it's still a cult that's run by men in a culture where it's not even a question, whether the men are in charge or not. And so she becomes, the cult itself kind of reaffirms, I think, broader social norms around gender and power.
Mm-hmm. I realized that when you mention her consort again, that she's got to be one of the few goddesses worshipped in that way who isn't a virgin goddess then, because so often it's like if there's a major goddess, or certainly one with like a major cult following, other than maybe like Persephone or Demeter, like they're a virgin, Artemis or Athena, Hestia. So it's interesting that, and I mean maybe it's not unique, but it's interesting that way. And then that, just even that saying that reminded me what you were saying about earlier about her, there not being a lot of death and afterlife things associated with her. Do you, and I don't know why I hedged that, but do you think that's maybe to do with the fact that like the Eleusinian mysteries were already big enough, and like there was already such a there was sort of its own world devoted to the afterlife, and maybe that wasn't necessary? I don't know if that's something I really thought about, or
it's interesting because there are like other places in the empire where the death aspect is a lot more pronounced, and people are more interested in it. For maybe the Greeks have other options, and it is clear that particularly early Christian sources see a connection between Isis and Eleusinian Demeter. I think at the time there actually was a lesser connection than we've previously assumed, because it's possible that a lot of the mechanisms are based on like how the Eleusinian ministries worked in terms of what an initiation process is supposed to look like. And it's definitely clear that she's picking up a lot of Demeter's roles, but it doesn't seem like there's and there is worship of Isis at Eleusis, but it's not as tight as I think some people would like it to be, that connection. One of the things I think is kind of interesting, and I think it is, again, maybe a bit historically oriented, is it's clear that one of the things that Isis was most valued for in Ptolemaic Egypt was her sense of reinforcing royalty, the king and queen. And so that's one of the epithets you hear most often in, for example, the Demotic text. Isis is the queen. And that aspect, in her very close connection to Serapis, I think that might have persisted long after the Greeks stopped necessarily seeing her as a deity that's specifically tied to like a monarchic government system. Is monarchical? I can't remember what word I'm supposed to use here.
I cannot say I know with any confidence, but I know what you mean.
Yeah, I think they stopped caring about it.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, they went through such a back and forth over those many hundreds of years, and whether or not they liked kings and queens. That's always interesting. This is well timed, as I talked to somebody just a couple weeks ago about the whole Hellenistic period, which is again not something that I'm super familiar with, and how important kings and queens were then, and I can see how Isis would sort of grow off of that. Do we know how? And I don't, because I need to learn more about Egyptian mythology. That's next on my list. But do we know how different she ended up being, like other than the death and Osiris of it all, like from what the Egyptians originally, maybe even like pre-Ptolemaic period thought of Isis?
It's really hard to draw that distinction just because each dynasty tended to change the mythology to suit their needs. So
that makes sense.
In some sense, whoever was going to end up in charge of Egypt, in the 3rd century, post Alexander, whether it was going to be Ptolemy or whether it was going to be an Egyptian or a Libyan or somebody else, they were going to change it. So that was probably the expectation in some capacity or another.
Mm-hmm.
One of the questions that some of my colleagues are working on is sort of what does Isis look like in Egypt during the Roman Empire versus how she's perceived elsewhere. And I think there you're seeing a bit more continuity, but that's not my particular area of expertise. So I don't want to get out here above my skis. But one of the things I think is particularly important about that is also recognizing that Egypt itself is going through such tremendous changes during the Hellenistic and Roman period in terms of how the traditional temple system is organized. Traditionally, temples have had some level of autonomy from the pharaoh, but now they don't have that autonomy because that's just not how Greek kings and Roman kings rule. There's a ton of reorganization around ethnic categories. So the Romans change who counts as an Egyptian, who counts as a Greek, and who counts as a Roman multiple times, and so do the Ptolemies. Yeah. So, and of course that's tied to your taxes and everything. So that of course would affect to how people are presenting in terms of racial categories, and that I think is important. And that's of course like a really vibrant area of research. And they're also at the same time they're receiving information from other cultures as well, new deities, new influences, new foods, new clothing. And so Egypt, we tend to, I think of it as very static because that's what the pharaohs wanted us to think of it as very static. They didn't want us to think of it as changing. But Egypt does change a lot during this time period. I think that's a really cool part of trying to untangle that knot of Isis and Egypt during the Roman Empire.
Yeah, well, and Egypt's just so fascinating because if we want to see any part of it as static, it was like long before the Greeks got there, right? Because they were just doing so much long before, so much earlier than the Greeks kind of coming in and changing things. So like you're dealing with a however many thousands of years old culture that's then suddenly dealing with the Greeks and then dealing with the Romans. And I can only imagine how much that would result in change because
and it really feeds into the information that I think Greeks had about Egypt, what they thought was going on there, because there are Greek communities living in Egypt, I think as early as the 8th century BC, like small pockets of people. And so that's definitely like one key aspect of this as well is, Herodotus, he maybe goes, I think he goes, but some people don't think he goes to Egypt and does his tour and writes his whole account of what Egypt is like. He's probably getting a lot of his information from resident Greek speakers, as well as priests who do speak Greek. So that there's a sense of that information is being curated for him. And it's already been sort of like filtered through this lens of who he can talk to and like where he can get information.
Yeah, that certainly makes sense. And then so much of what we end up knowing is based on him. And
it's as much myth as it is history, frankly.
Yeah. I need to read more Herodotus because that I hear sort of phrases like that so often, and that's interesting in itself. Like a man who kind of presented himself like he was, presenting history, but at the same time, like he didn't see history as we see it now, and let alone that history is subjective anyway, and then to deal with the language barrier if you're going to Egypt, but you're talking to Greeks, and then what are they saying? And that's really interesting. I'm now also like simultaneously thinking of what episodes I can create to accompany this conversation of like, okay, how can I talk about Isis or Egypt or what have you? Because there's just so much there.
Yeah, he really is just like making this. In some ways they call it some scholars call it like this Egyptian mirage. Like he's making these myths about Egypt, and he has these like stories that are coming out, and then he also has like very technical details of like how big he thinks the Nile is. Where does he think it comes from? They really are freaked out about the fact that the Nile flows south to north. That like is historically a major issue that they cannot deal with.
Really?
They cannot hang.
That's so funny because that's just different for them because they're used to Greece. Yeah.
Well, to be fair, most rivers do flow towards the equator, and they've been north of the equator this whole time.
Right.
And now all of a sudden it's just like, this river's going the other direction. What do we do? It's really long.
Yeah, and big. I don't think. Well, I know Greece doesn't have anything like that. So
no, it's truly something they flip about. Like several Roman emperors send ill-fated expeditions to find the source of the Nile.
Just because they couldn't get over it. Like, no.
Couldn't deal.
Oh, that's really funny. I love hearing about those, like all the natural phenomena stuff and how they dealt with it, because it's just it's so interesting. Like,
Yeah,
and then
they
how
really
they dealt with
have
it
a lot.
over however long, like, and people learning more things and changing their weird views on how they understood all of that. Yeah. Oh, that's great. Now I'm going to read more Herodotus. But
Well, I've done my job then.
yeah. So when it comes to like, realized that you'd sent me an article right before we got on this call, so I just glanced at it. But I was interested in seeing, what work you've done on like the depictions of, it was like women wearing Isis's clothes, right? And then how that linked to the religion or the worship of her.
Yeah. So it seems like costume is a really big part of this religion. We hear, Apuleius gives us very detailed descriptions of this this procession that has people in all sorts of crazy costumes. And he pays a lot of attention to the detail there. And we have wall paintings again from the region of Pompeii that depict these crazy processions that maybe are thought to be Isaic. And then you also get sort of descriptions in epigraphic texts about, who's going to pay for what textiles. And you have somebody who's, a handful of priests called the Anubophore. So he's someone who's clearly doing something with Anubis, potentially dressing up as Anubis. So it seems like that is a really important part of the cult. And this ties into the bigger problem of initiation. It's rather difficult, obviously, to reconstruct what's supposed to be a very secret process. Apuleius tells us, his version of what he thinks happened. A lot of scholars have gone back and forth about how reliable that is. It's a very it's probably not super interesting for like anyone who is listening to this podcast to get into. But ultimately, it sort of comes down to this question of whether you think all of that book is supposed to be funny or not.
Right.
So that becomes one of the bigger questions. I think that the person who probably has the best perspective on is Richard Gordon. He points out that, look, it seems like Apuleius knows a good deal about the cult in general. We don't really have a lot of good reasons to doubt him. But at the same time, even if this is like 100% true, he's an initiate himself. He went through it. He can only tell us about what happened at one site at one time. There's not a sense that this is necessarily the same across all of Greece, let alone the entire Mediterranean. So I think that that's a really good point that I like to keep in mind. But supposedly this initiation process involved being specially called to the goddess, like the goddess had to appear to you and tell you that you were ready to be an initiate. Then you do some sort of sacred learning through hieroglyphic texts. They're read to you by the priest. Then there seems to be like a 3-night initiate specific set of rites that involve. One involves crawling around on the floor looking for potentially the parts of Osiris, which is tied to So one of Isis's myths is that this is a sort of an origin story that she and Osiris are having like a really nice time, and then Osiris and Seth get into a conflict, and Seth he plays dirty. He kills Osiris and chops him up into a bunch of pieces and scatters them across the either Egypt or the Mediterranean, depending on the version. And so Isis has to go and find them all, and then she sews them all back together and creates the first mummy. And then through magic, she manages to use his penis to impregnate herself, and that becomes the way she becomes the mother of Horus. Yeah, so typical
mythology.
Yeah, typical myth where you're just like, don't worry about that. That's fine. So that's thought to be some version of that myth. And then there's another part that I found particularly interesting, in which the character's name is Lucius in the novel. He gets dressed up in this very elaborate costume as the god's soul, and he stands on a dais and then like stares at, or is either he comes face to face with the goddess, but then also is sort of worshipped as a cult statue himself. So there's a couple of like readings about what that could potentially be, but it does seem like dressing in the guise of the god and receiving veneration is part of an initiation rite. That is practiced in some places. Thessaloniki in northern Greece seems to be one where we're pretty confident that that one's happening. So for me, what you then see sometimes in Athens that also suggests that this might be happening there, it's actually like one of the most common types of funerary portraiture that exists in Athens is women dressed up as Isis. So they're dressed up as her. She's got a very particular costume. It's very weird. It is not something that people are just wearing. And so I was particularly interested in as to why. One of it is obviously trying to, well, at least in my view, it seems pretty obvious that they're trying to assert that they are initiates, that they've achieved this very elite status in the cult. But it also seems to be, because these are not aimed just at cult members, actually aimed at the world at large. So it does seem like these are potentially also trying to make a bigger statement in Athenian culture about, who we are and what we do. And it seems like this is a common trope where you'll see men dressed up in very traditional, civic citizen costumes, and women will be dressed up in like particularly ethnic costumes or others dressed. You see this actually quite a lot. And so this is potentially a method of sort of threading the needle between saying our family is really, we're fine, upstanding citizens, but we also like have power in this other realm.
That's really interesting. And then it's specific to women, which, is interesting just based on what you were saying about the cult of Isis not being particularly not what we would say is feminist. Certainly nothing really is back then. But not being aimed at women. That's interesting that they would be the ones kind of showing that off.
It is interesting. There are a handful of these that actually depict men in the dress of Isis. I would describe them as sculptural failures. And to me, that's very fascinating. I love a sculptural failure. And so it does seem like for a handful of men, they were trying to do that for whatever reason, whether they were, it was a deeply personal thing for them to be an initiate, whether they actually chose to dress up as Isis, which of course opens up some really interesting questions about, as you mentioned here, gender, or, whether we're looking at, something where we're just like, they make mistakes on these things sometimes. Like you'll see, there'll be 2 people and 5 hands on the statue. And you're like, okay, 5 hands is fine, I guess. So whether we're looking at something like that, but I do think that the fact that there are sort of these kind of ones that I would describe as errors or outliers, I do think it does suggest that this is something that is otherwise pretty closely tied to the role that women play in their families, which is sort of in many ways actually as an expression of status and as a bearer of identities that are important to the family rather than necessarily as depictions in and of their own right.
Interesting. So it's more so that the women were just sort of there to be shown off. Like, they got to depict that the family was involved with ISIS in whatever way. That's interesting. So what do you, when you call them failures, like what does that mean? Like sculptural failures, what does that mean exactly? Like, are they all like obviously mess ups, like 5 hands style, or like what's that?
So the best preserved one is for this guy named not Sosibius. Sorry, I'm totally blanking on this guy's name. This best preserved one is actually it's in the like a storeroom that belongs to the city of Athens, their civic archive there. And so this guy, he's wearing like, normally men wear a pretty traditional garment. They'll either be nude underneath or they'll have like what's called a chiton. So it's basically like a sleeved tunic. And then they'll have the himation, which is like it's like a big piece of cloth that they wrap in a particular way. So this is clearly some way in which, because Isis is the costume that's most popular, is very particular because it has basically these 4 corners of a cloth tied into like a big old knot in the middle of the, like right in between the breasts. Sometimes it's up here above the heart, but the most popular one is the one that's right over the breasts. And then it creates this like particular set of drapery folds that run down the front. It's very like idiosyncratic. And so for this, they kind of tried to do this thing where they tried to make a version of the chiton and himation that would have the 4 straps. But one of the straps isn't holding anything. So why is it there? And so, it's one of these things where clearly like we were trying to make a relief that worked well with like traditional male clothing, but the actual outfit he's trying to reference is so gendered female that they like can't quite make it work.
Gotcha. Yeah, I like that. I'm glad I asked. 'Cause that's absolutely like, yeah, it's like we're trying to do the ISIS, but it doesn't actually work because it's got to be a woman's clothes, but then still trying to make that point. And I'm just curious, but like, do we know these guys, were they unmarried? And so they were like, they couldn't just you have a woman show that off?
It's bizarre because he has his wife right there. She's standing
Okay.
right next to him, just wearing traditional like female clothing for women. She's
Huh.
even got like a very up to date hairdo. So for whatever reason, they didn't. She wasn't going to be depicted wearing the clothing.
Yeah.
And there's anything I would say about that would be like wild speculation. Like maybe she just like really
Yeah.
hated the cult of ISIS. It was like under no circumstances are you going to put that on me, but she also could have easily been dead, and it's
Mhm.
very easy to just do whatever, tell dead people do whatever you want.
Yeah.
So again, it's somebody was trying something. They were trying to do
Yeah.
something with that. I don't think it quite worked. But
Yeah. I like to also just wonder about like how many cases are just an artist making a stupid choice and like
mhm.
that's all we have. And like maybe it had nothing to do with the people who were actually depicted and the artist was just like, I'm gonna try something and it really failed. And then we have to speculate all these different things about what it actually means, and maybe it means like absolutely nothing. I mean, this just addresses
Yeah,
so many different possibilities of like what could just be
yeah.
an artist being weird.
I mean, when you go to the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, I think it's you're upstairs and you see all the stuff, and they have all this amazing stuff. And this is actually kind of true of most museums. And then you go to the storeroom, and you
Mm.
realize just like how much stuff they have that is not on display. So like whenever I go down there to say these grave reliefs, they have like this whole room that's, I mean, like the size of like a basketball stadium, like a basketball court. And it's just stacks of these things. And so like if I go, like I have to make an appointment like several weeks in advance because they have to get somebody down there to like get the forklift to move the other
Yeah.
ones to get to the one I need. So it's like very clearly a very difficult job. And of course you don't want to like break the other ones. They're still important, even if I don't need them. And so it is really, it's a lot of work to think about. And, you just think about how many people lived in Athens and died in Athens, and, how many
Yeah.
grave reliefs there were, and, how many tombs there were. And, even with that, these things are actually relatively portable compared to some of the other objects that are in Athens. So a lot of them got taken. There's
Yeah.
examples of these actually. There's one in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. Like somebody just clearly picked this up in Athens in the 19th century and just put it on a boat. It
Yeah.
probably wasn't even that hard.
I mean, yeah, the story of so much out of museums, right?
Mhm.
But that's I never even think about that. But yeah, I mean, God, that city must just have so much. And that's just what's left over after so many people
Mhm.
did take things.
Yeah.
Um, but I mean, I know they've done so much excavation, like just the stuff that's in the Acropolis Museum versus in the
Yeah.
old Acropolis Museum. And I don't know how much of that they found more recently, but I have been to both, which is like a big thrill for me that I
Mhm.
managed to get over
Yeah.
there before they changed over. Cause I'm like, the difference is so incredible.
Yeah. They're totally different types of museums, really.
Yeah. Well, and just like the size, they're just so like little. The one up on the
Mhm.
rock, was there recently and just looking at that building again, thinking like how little actually fit into that
Yeah.
versus the new one. It's fascinating. I missed the archaeological museum on my last visit though, and now I'm regretting it even more.
Well, I mean, it'll still be there,
Oh
and
well.
there's plenty of good statues still in
Oh
there.
yeah. No, it's just more me like longing for Athens kind of at every
Yes.
moment of the day. Um that's so interesting. And I was actually talking to somebody recently about grave statues and everything in Athens as well, and the way some of these things are depicted. But it's just so interesting to think of like what stands out to us now, and so
Mhm.
what gets studied, or just what we have versus what is still to be found or totally lost or what have you, because exactly like you said, like the number of people that would have died there and the number of statues that would have been made, or just like notations and inscriptions and things. And it's just anyway, obviously I could go on and on about just like the what if of it all, but I'm fascinated by these statuary failures. That's amazing. And then generally just that women kind of served as a sort of an object for depicting family, importance
Mhm.
or like priorities or what have you. That's really interesting. And
Yeah, and it's it's one thing also to keep in mind too. Like we don't really know who's really behind funerary monuments. Like
mhm,
if you were to go today and say who picks most funerary monuments in a cemetery, it would be women because that's
mhm,
traditionally like we tend to do that for our families. We tend to handle things like end of life care and funeral planning and things like that. But it seems like maybe this was maybe more of a gendered male activity in the Roman Empire to design the funerary monuments and make sure that they came out right. But it
mhm,
doesn't mean that you wouldn't have necessarily like no say. But it's this is of
mhm.
course one of those really great questions that we will never ever fully be able to answer.
Yeah. I mean, like so many questions about the role of women generally because
Hmm.
just things never got written down in
Yeah.
whatever way that we need. Sorry, now my brain is blanking on further questions, but I'd love to hear more if there's more you have to say about ISIS
Trying to
worship
think.
generally.
I think one of the coolest things about ISIS worship too is that the few little paintings we have from the Pompeii Museum as well as from other wall paintings in the area indicate that it's also just like a really sensory experience. It's meant to kind of overload you. So we
Hmm.
know that they're really into music, they're really into dance. So that we know that they are playing. Like a lot of people would have these little rattles. They're called a sistrum. They're very like, they come over from Egypt. And so going into an ISIS sanctuary during a rite would have been like a really, I mean, there's color, there's dance, there's music, there's sort of people dressed up in costumes. It's really performative in a lot of ways. And so I think that that's
Mhm.
just like a really interesting and exciting aspect of this cult that can get lost is I think it would have been really fun to be an ISIS devotee in a lot of ways.
It sounds like it. Yeah, like a really interesting party.
I certainly, definitely. There's a lot going on there, and just
Mhm.
I think a lot of people would have really gotten that. Might be another reason why a lot of people might have joined. It might have just been like pretty cool.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, if your main mystery cult is like all about death, and I mean, I don't know
Hmm.
enough about the Eleusinian mysteries, but they
Yeah.
obviously revolve around death. So if it's sort of there's another one that you can join and be a part of where it's more like an exciting party of dancing and music and wearing cool costumes and all this, like it sounds like it would be very appealing.
Yeah.
The way that that worship and cultural things expanded across the whole of the Mediterranean is
Hmm.
just perpetually one of the most interesting things, which also then just reminded me that you mentioned so that there's even evidence of Isis worship up by Hadrian's Wall, did you say? So like
Hmm.
even that far off in the Roman
Yeah.
Empire, we know that they worshipped her. That's really interesting. And so it was like
Yeah.
similar style that we know of, or do we is there minimal knowledge or what I don't know.
So in terms of like regional studies, mine is sort of the first of a province. So I picked
Mm,
Greece. There's a lot of people who've looked at it in Italy, in particular. And so we know a little bit more. And it's actually quite interesting. There's really quite a lot of differences. So it does seem like, for example, people who I think I hope I make a pretty compelling argument for the fact that like people in Greece who are ISIS devotees, like it is something that they could like have really meaningful identification feelings
mhm,
towards. But it doesn't seem like that's the case for Italy.
mm.
It seems like there it is a little bit less, oriented around creating a sense of identification. For example,
Hmm.
we don't have evidence of any of these hymns, for example, in Italy.
Oh, right, yeah, you're
Yeah, so we
yeah.
don't know if they actually believe the same things about ISIS as the Greek speakers did. We don't know, like we have like a lot more Egyptian imports, for example. One of the things that's kind of bizarre about the sanctuaries I looked at is that there's very few Egyptian imports, almost none in most
Mm,
sanctuaries. Whereas in Italy, you have a lot of evidence of Egypt, of them importing stuff from Egypt. So one of the things I think is happening there is I think in different provinces, this cult is serving different functions.
mhm,
And so I think in Italy, it might have served a more sort of geopolitical function, if that makes sense, a way for people to sort of feel like they controlled Egypt and to imagine that control. Whereas I think in Greece, it becomes a little bit more about how to imagine a different form of being Greek that is a bit more cosmopolitan, but it does have like, this sense of control, but it's a different kind of control. It's like a cosmic versus a political control.
Interesting. It sounds
Mm-hmm.
nicer.
Yeah, I mean, I think so.
Yeah.
And then when you start getting into other places, like I have some colleagues who work in like Romania and Serbia and Croatia, and they just have so many Egyptian imports, just like huge quantities of the stuff, even more than they had in Italy. And it's you have then also you find these one of the things that you find all the time are these reliefs that depict footprints. And that is something that you see in Egyptian religion as well. You do see depictions of these footprints that are often used to depict pilgrims' feet, sort of like people who went on pilgrimages. And then you have them in Spain, and you have them in Macedonia in pretty big numbers. And it seems like they're used differently in different regions. So I think there's actually was quite a bit of variability depending on region and time in how the cults were practiced and what they were really for.
That's wonderful. I mean, and sort of, obviously, like I prefer Greece overall generally, so it's nice to hear that theirs just sounded like fun and like community based and identity and I don't know. That's very interesting. Generally this is incredibly fascinating, and I'm just like, it's so hard sometimes to take it in, and then I'm like, I just want to learn.
It's such a weird thing because again, it's something that you would never think was as important as it was.
Yeah.
Based on like reading just a Greco-Roman culture book, a history book, even an archaeology book. Like you'd never think this was a big deal, and it really is.
Yeah, well, exactly. That's the thing. I mean, I've been studying Greek mythology incredibly in depth for the past 5 years, and like my whole knowledge is the Io story, the connection with Isis in that way. And then so to hear this like huge expansion of her in that region, like so far beyond anything Io, is so fascinating. And it then means that I have nothing to contribute. I just want to listen because I'm like, oh, all of my knowledge is completely tapped out. This is amazing. I'm like just learning so much more that I'll then go look into.
I think too, it is when you kind of like get past the fact that you're like, okay, so this is very like weird. It kind of fits into the rules. They make it fit the rules. Isis behaves in ways that are very, predictable compared to like, she's going to act the same way that a Greco-Roman god is going to act. Mm-hmm. She's going to actually be depicted in Greco-Roman style. Almost all the actual statues, particularly in Greece, are just like carved like a Greek statue. And in fact, the way you tell that a statue is Serapis is like two of the most minor pieces of iconography you could possibly imagine. Serapis is a part in his beard.
Oh wow, and that's it.
Yeah, his beard is parted, and then the other is that he wears a chiton, and his chiton goes all the way to the plinth instead of stopping at the ankle.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so like again, hugely easy to tell him apart from gods like Zeus or Poseidon, or Asclepius.
Yeah.
Like you wouldn't have an issue doing that, especially if you didn't have his head.
What about Isis then? Like how I mean, I guess the clothing that you described, is that her the main way you tell that it's her?
Yeah, so clothing is a really big one. So she has two costumes. The one I described with the knot over the chest, that one's pretty easy to spot because even the dress folds are very weird. She has a second one that's called the diplax that looks pretty much the same as a normal sort of woman's costume in this period. So that one's much more difficult. She'll often have a floral garland, which is kind of nice. And then in terms of, she's got a very particular hairstyle. She has kind of what we would call sausage locks. I don't know. My mom was really into curling my hair when I was a little kid. So when you that very 80s style where you would just like do like the Goldilocks curls around the big barrel curling iron, very much like that. So that's sort of her thing. And then she often will have a hole drilled into the top of her head because she has all these crowning implements, usually made out of metal, and so they would have just jammed them in up top there.
Interesting. So do we have any of those left, or they're probably mostly gone and we just have the hole, or?
We mostly just have the whole. We have a lot of
Yeah.
bronze statuettes of her.
Mm.
Those were popular in the art market. So you find those all over the place. Like the Met has a ton, the Getty has some, the Boston MFA has some, the Louvre has a bunch. And so there you often see these. It's really quite elaborate headdress that sort of includes like the solar disc and the cobra.
Okay.
Sometimes she has the two feathers of Ma'at. So it incorporates a lot of her very like more traditional Egyptian iconography.
That was going to be my question. Yeah, because that sounds very, very Egyptian. So does that end up meaning that what's left of her in, say, like marble statues in Greece and things like just tends to look, I mean, like a Greek goddess wearing a funny costume because we don't have any of the more Egyptian stuff?
Yeah, no, I think it's on purpose in Greece in particular. I think they really are trying to make a visual version of her that also kind of retcons her, that makes her look like other deities. I think that there's a visual strategy as well as a mythological one. And so she really does, particularly Dip Black's ones, she looks a lot like pretty much any other deity. She even has a type where she's suckling baby Horus or Harpocrates, as he's more often called in Greece, that does look a lot like the Eleusinian Demeter. That one's more popular in Asia Minor. It's not as popular in mainland Greece, but she's the nursing mother that you do occasionally see that. It's pretty close to the Eleusinian Demeter, although the Eleusinian Demeter doesn't often nurse.
That's so interesting. What did you say the Horus is called in Greek?
In Greece, he's usually referred to as Harpocrates, which is sort of, it's very similar. He again also comes out of Ptolemaic Egypt. He's sort of this child god that young boys are particularly commonly like sort of connected to. So you actually see on a lot of those Fayum portraits, the panel paintings of mummies, you often see like these boys with like truly the worst hairdos of all time, where they're like partially shaved and then like have like these two weird like bite marks in the front, or like they are all shaved except for like this one rat tail. That's actually an indication that someone has been dedicated to Harpocrates. A really bad haircut.
Yeah. I can picture a couple of those for sure.
Yeah. And so Harpocrates is popular in Greece. He's actually not as popular as Anubis, Anubis is bizarre because I have lots of statues of Harpocrates. I do not have a single statue of Anubis that actually has the head on, which would have been the problem for them.
Yeah,
I was just going to Vatican. There's actually one in the Vatican. Hadrian had one. It's very ugly.
Oh, of course Hadrian had one. Yeah,
of course he did.
Yeah,
it's deeply ugly, and it makes me really happy because I love a good ugly statue.
Now I've got to see that. That's really interesting. Yeah, because that was going to be my next question: is like, how do they negotiate any kind of involvement with Anubis when like he is so explicitly has the jackal head? Like there is no other Anubis.
Yeah, and the other thing too is he's so explicitly tied in the Greek idea with, in Egypt he's so clearly tied to mummification and death.
Yeah.
He doesn't have much of a personality in Greece that we can tell. He's mentioned most often. You'll see a dedication to Isis, Serapis, and Anubis. Harpocrates can be the third, occasionally Osiris or other ones, but the two most common are Anubis and Harpocrates. With Anubis definitely more common. And you do occasionally see like areas described as like the place for Anubis, or the shrine to Anubis within a sanctuary. So they are worshiping him. I don't know what they think he is. We do have a part of one of these hymns to Anubis, but unfortunately it breaks off like pretty shortly after the preamble. So we can tell what it was, but we can't actually tell what they thought he was doing.
Disappointing.
Yeah, because he's an odd one for them to be so excited about.
Yeah,
Harpocrates makes a lot more sense because they make him look like Eros, and like it ties into the whole thing of, Isis is Venus or Aphrodite, and like he makes sense. I get why they picked him up. I don't get what Anubis is for.
No, that's really interesting because he is just so iconically only half human.
Right.
Yeah, and in I've never thought about it in that way, but like obviously in Greek mythology, all of or for the most part, their half human mythological characters are like shitty in whatever way, right? Like either the Minotaur or the Centaur, or like you've got satyrs, but other than that, and even they're not like revered in any kind of like deep divine way. So you mentioned the connections with Aphrodite, Venus, and Isis. Does that carry on when they're worshiping Isis in this really explicit way?
Yeah, it does. So sometimes you do see dedications to like literally Isis Aphrodite. So that is a one of her more popular epithets. But there's actually this really interesting thing that also happens where so they'll share Greek sanctuaries tend to have multiple gods worshipped within them. And Aphrodite tends to appear somewhat often. So one of the chapters of my book focuses on Thessaloniki, where we know that there's several statues of Aphrodite, including a really, really gorgeous one of this very sexy Aphrodite type called the Louvre Naples type, where she's sort of pulling the drapery over her head, and it's very like see-through and clingy. It's like a very beautiful copy of that type. And so one of the things that's interesting there to me is that you also then have one of these hymns in the sanctuary talking about Isis's relationship with Aphrodite. And so to me, that suggests that part of what you're supposed to do as an Isis devotee is really find Isis in other deities, and really sort of explore that tension between Isis as the main singular deity and the ways in which she sort of comprises all of the other gods. And it also might have been a nice way for them to kind of integrate Isis into this very traditional pantheon, is to sort of have her be so closely connected to these gods that she sort of also has subsumed.
Yeah, because that's the connection I've always understood, is sort of like linking them very specifically to an existing god, versus when you blew my mind and said that they just like straight up put her into the origin story. That's so different from this idea that, because of course, you have the same thing with like Ishtar and Inanna and their connections with Aphrodite, and just the way that, I mean, and that makes so much sense when you're dealing with such a large area where they interacted and, worked within each other's cultures in whatever ways that they did. You're going to have these connections where it's like, oh, you've got a goddess of love and sex or what have you, and we've got one too, so they must be connected. But to then take on Isis so much more directly into their pantheon is so interesting, and I just had no idea. It's just
it is a deep cut in Greek lists. It's a very deep cut to get into the Isis hymns. They're very odd in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
They're not something that a lot of people like read in their spare time.
But that's so interesting. Like, this is what I love about all of this, is those little things that once you learn them seem like a pretty big deal. But maybe it's just because this is my entire existence, is like taking on this stuff. But it seems like a huge deal, and then the fact that it isn't particularly well known is just extra wonderful. It's great.
Yeah, it is. And I think one of the other things that I liked most about this is it's a way to think about different groups of Greeks that are all living in competition at the same time. Because one of the biggest sort of things that happens when you talk about like Greece under the Roman Empire is the first thing that people does come to mind. The thing that people do read is Second Sophistic literature, which is fascinating and very cool in its own right. It's extremely deeply weird, which I love. And the Second Sophistic has a very particular view of what Greekness is. They're really concerned with that question because it's mostly, the authors are mostly very elite Greek men, many of whom are actually also Roman citizens, who come from the traditional families. They're all working in Athens philosophical schools. A lot of them, are philosophers and authors too. And so they're really interested in trying to come up with who are we? What is our deal? And they kind of come up with a very like well-defined answer. They're really excited about 5th century Athens, and they love Plato, and they love Demosthenes. They love sort of that traditional canon of classical Athenian literature. And so they write in this way that's very clear that they're trying to position themselves as the inheritors of that, saying that we're able to revive this great, wonderful classical past through our intellectual activity. And that sort of is really what Greece can bring, is this pure, unadulterated form of excellence that's direct from this particular social and historical milieu. And like that's a very defined version of Greekness. It's very neat. It's very tidy. But also that's 28 dudes who all know each other, many of whom are related to each other. they like this. It would basically be like going to Yale and be like, what is America? But like you're actually only asking like the full professors at Yale, and then like saying this is the answer for all of America in the 21st century. And we weren't even going to worry about Canada in this.
Well, America never worries about Canada.
It's true. It's true. They never think about Canada. And so for me, that one of the things I like most about being able to study this group of ISIS devotees is it's another opinion. It sort of broadens our perspective. This is a group of people that's, they're going back to the 8th century. They want to go back to, Hesiod and Homer, and they want to make a version of Greekness through ISIS that's, actually doesn't have really a timeline, a time boundary, or even a geography boundary, because it can contain the Nile, it can contain Egypt. And so it becomes, it points out there are other options, there are other opinions about what it means to be Greek in the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
That are all kind of available. And it's interesting because they actually kind of use the same technique that the second sophistic writers do. They just kind of end up with a different set of answers.
Fascinating as everything.
Yeah. The second sophistic writers are very fun. They're very super weird. Plutarch has these minor treatises called the Moralia that, like, there's one called Greek and Roman Questions, and it's just like, why do the Romans do this? And it's some sort of like weird explanation as to why the Romans do the things they do. And then it's like most of it's about Platonic philosophy, but it gets pretty wild. So highly recommend if you want to. And then there's Alice Gellius, who's just sort of like, let me tell you weird gossip about all of my friends.
I mean, ancient writing that is like so accessible in that kind of way of gossipy, or I mean, even I just found it by reading some of the Ars Amatoria where I'm like, oh my God, it's gross in such a modern way. We're like, that alone is so interesting, just the ways these things are just so universal over so many thousands of years. And it's, I mean, often in the worst of ways, but it's just still so entertaining all the same.
Yeah, they're really it's really fascinating how little has changed sometimes.
Exactly. And and sometimes in the most disturbing of ways, and yet at least we can laugh at it. Is there, just before I let you go, is there anything you want to share with my listeners, anywhere to follow you or read more or anything?
You're welcome to follow me on Twitter. My handle is at FEDarling194, which is a Maltese Falcon reference. It's not just random words. And my book is coming out on Cambridge's website on the 24th of February. So
wonderful.
Get it through your university library or something like that. And I think that's probably it.
Wonderful. Sounds good. I'm going to grab your book so I can research more about this and do a whole episode on it. So thank you.
Yeah, well, I hope you enjoy it.
Oh, nerds, as always, thank you so much for listening. Again, I fucking love these conversations. This one was just so fascinating and so unexpected. I mean, I jumped at it because basically Lindsey told me ISIS, ancient Greece, and I said, hell yes, let's talk. But also I wanted to link it up to Women's History Month, which, sure, it's coming out the day after, but I'm still counting it. That's why it's coming before the Hellenistic episodes, which are upcoming, which I did record beforehand. That's a little too much peek behind the curtain. But honestly, I just love when I get these unexpected and utterly, unbelievably fascinating episodes. Like, what a cool job I have. Anyway, thank you all for joining me, for listening, for wanting conversation episodes at all, for engaging with them, all of it. You can find a link to Lindsey's Twitter in the episode's description, along with a link to her book on this topic. Yay, episode descriptions, because they've got all the links you need. Let's Talk About Myths, Baby is written and produced by me, Liv Albert. Michaela Smith is the Hermes to my Olympian and handles so many podcast-related things, from running the YouTube to creating promotional images and videos to editing and research, so much more. The podcast is hosted and monetized by Acast. You're all the best. This is cool. I am Liv and I love this shit very much.